On a May morning in 1536, at the Tower of London, a woman who had once been the Queen of England awaited the final judgment of her life. Anne Boleyn, a name that had once shaken an entire kingdom, was now just a silent figure behind cold stone walls, waiting for death. Her story is not merely a historical verdict, but one of the most tragic chapters in the Tudor dynasty. And for over 500 years, the world has continued to ask, was Anne truly guilty? Or was she simply the victim of a ruthless political conspiracy, masked in the name of law? According to historian Hilary Mantel, no one could survive in the Tudor court without understanding the rules of the game. But Anne Boleyn, with her intelligence and sharp wit, believed she could redefine those rules. And perhaps that very belief led her to her downfall.
In any case, I have only a little now.
Anne was not born into royalty. She was raised in Europe, educated in France, and deeply influenced by the refined lifestyle and humanist ideals of the Renaissance.
I have come here to die, or to pray for the life of the king.
Upon her return to England, Anne was unlike any other woman at court. She was astute, well-educated, proud, and irresistibly captivating. It was precisely this uniqueness that captured the heart of King Henry VIII, who at the time was still married to Queen Catherine. But this was no mere romantic affair. To marry Anne, Henry divorced Catherine, an act that had no precedent in the Catholic Church. From that moment, Henry broke ties with the Pope, established the Church of England, and declared himself its supreme head. All of it, just to make Anne his wife. Historian Eric Ives once remarked, Anne Boleyn was the catalyst for England's religious reformation. But once she was no longer useful, that very system devoured her. Anne bore Henry a daughter Elizabeth, but failed to produce a male heir. This was an unforgivable shortcoming in the eyes of the king and his court. When Jane Seymour, a quiet, obedient lady-in-waiting, caught the king's favour, Anne's position began to crumble. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's powerful right-hand man, seized the opportunity. He fabricated a series of outrageous accusations that Anne had committed adultery with several men at court, even with her own brother. These charges, though lacking credible evidence, were more than enough to condemn a woman in a patriarchal society, especially one who had fallen out of the king's favour. On May 15th, 1536, Anne was put on trial. The court, comprised of men with deep political ties to the king, swiftly sentenced her to death. However, the verdict made no mention of how she was to be executed. Under English law at the time, a queen found guilty of such crimes would often be burned at the stake. But Henry, in an act of so-called mercy,
homewrecker, trollop, you would not believe the things that they love to call Anne Boleyn,
ordered she be executed by sword instead of axa, more refined French method. A skilled swordsman was summoned from Calais.
Depressingly, it tended to be the births of male heirs that were well recorded. Girls were largely forgotten as a result.
Yet, as historian Susanna Lipscomb has noted, Henry's humanity was nothing more than a means of controlling even the manner of Anne's death. Ironically, the executioner had been summoned days before the verdict was even delivered, meaning Anne's fate had been sealed long before she stepped into the courtroom. On the early morning of May 19th, Anne awoke in a small room within the Tower of London. She took her final Holy Communion, receiving forgiveness from God if it was needed, and dressed in simple garments, a grey gown with a red underdress, symbolizing devotion and sacrifice. On her way to the scaffold, Eyewitnesses described her as still smiling, her head held high, walking with the grace of a true queen.
The affair between Mary and Henry began to fizzle out. It was partly because he always lost interest in his affairs, and he found her accommodating and very sweet, but not particularly.
Before the silent crowd, Anne spoke. "I am not here to accuse anyone. I only ask that you pray for me. And I pray God saves my soul." She made no accusations, begged for no mercy, even though she knew she was innocent. It was not weakness, but her final act of defiance, a quiet nobility in the face of tragedy. When the sword came down, the horrified crowd watched as Anne's head fell, her lips still moving in silent prayer. 3 loyal ladies-in-waiting knelt beside her, gathered her remains, wrapped them in coarse cloth, and buried her hastily in an old arrow chest taken from the tower's armory.
The thing is, once he was getting a divorce and he made it clear he wanted to marry her, there was no one else in that kingdom she could marry. There was no one that was going to risk his wrath to marry her. So her options were to become a nun or marry him.
Henry did not attend. He was waiting for the cannon fire from the tower, the signal that Anne was dead. Upon hearing it, he boarded his royal barge to meet Jane Seymour, who would soon become his 3rd wife. Anne Boleyn was not merely a beautiful woman at the Tudor court. She was the embodiment of ambition, intellect, and a storm that would forever change history. Born around 1501 at Blickling Hall, Norfolk, into a rising noble family, Anne grew up in Europe, primarily in the Netherlands and France, where she was educated in Renaissance culture, religion, and courtly manners. Unlike most English women of her time, Anne spoke fluent French, possessed a quick mind, and demonstrated formidable political acumen. These qualities made her different and dangerous. As historian Alison Weir observes, Anne was not some innocent victim of a palace conspiracy.
She'd done what no other woman had ever done before. She grabbed the king for herself. And most of all, she was really the true wife of the king. He was in love with her. It wasn't an arranged marriage that he'd done for dynastic purposes. He was utterly in love with her. And so she was now the queen.
She was a political player, and it was precisely because she played the game so well that she was ultimately taken down. The conquest of Anne Boleyn's heart was a drawn-out battle that lasted nearly 7 years, and perhaps the most costly pursuit in British royal history. When Henry VIII first encountered Anne, he had already been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 2 decades, yet had no male heir. Anne, unlike many before her, refused to become just another mistress. She insisted on only one role: queen. It was a bold challenge.
A woman who was very religious, who had refused to become the king's mistress no matter what. That's when you get all the stories of Anne's bad temper. Well, how she didn't just start stabbing Henry, I don't know.
To marry Anne, Henry had to do the unthinkable divorce his wife, despite the Pope's firm refusal to grant an annulment. In defiance, Henry declared England's separation from the Roman Catholic Church, established the Church of England, and named himself its supreme head. This seismic shift not only shook Europe, but also ignited the English Reformation. His love for Anne led him to dismantle centuries of religious tradition. Historian Eric Ives wrote, "Anne Boleyn was the spark that set an entire religious order ablaze. Not because she wanted it, but because Henry wanted her so much, he was willing to burn everything down. It was love that elevated Anne Boleyn to the throne, but it was that same love, once it turned cold, that led her to the scaffold. After 3 years of marriage, Anne failed to produce a male heir. To Henry VIII, this was not merely a personal disappointment, it was a political disaster. The Tudor dynasty required a male successor to ensure its stability. Henry's affection cooled, and in its place grew public contempt. In the shadows of the palace, another woman was rising. Jane Seymour, gentle, reserved, and free of controversy. Her quiet demeanor stood in stark contrast to the now embattled queen. Yet it wasn't Jane who plotted Anne's downfall. The mastermind was Thomas Cromwell Henry's powerful and cunning chief minister. The alliance between Cromwell and Anne had soured due to clashing political visions and struggles for influence. Cromwell controlled the kingdom's finances. Anne championed radical religious reform. As Henry began to withdraw from Anne, Cromwell sensed the moment to strike, not only to remove her, but to secure his own grip on power and make room for Jane. He engineered a web of outrageous accusations. Anne was charged with adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. This wasn't just adultery, it was incest, a claim so grotesque that it shocked the court and public alike. But Cromwell didn't stop there. He escalated the charges to the realm of treason. Anne, he alleged, plotted to poison the king and seize the throne. The evidence? Coerced confessions, baseless whispers, and the calculated testimonies of courtiers aligned with Cromwell. Professor Susanna Lipscomb, a leading historian on the Tudor era, offered a scathing analysis. Anne's trial was a farce. There was no credible evidence, just vague, implausible accusations. But in a court where power was the only law, truth was irrelevant. Anne was denied the right to legal counsel. She had no defender to shield her name from the avalanche of lies. One by one, the men once loyal to her were condemned and executed before her trial even began. Their deaths staged as proof to legitimize the fate already reserved for her. The courtroom became a theater where the tragedy had been scripted in advance. And when the death sentence was declared an unprecedented verdict against a reigning queen, Henry postured as merciful, ordering a sword instead of the traditional axe. The sword was deemed quicker, more humane. But the grim truth? That sword had been brought over from France even before the trial commenced. Her death wasn't a consequence. It was the objective all along. Anne Boleyn, the woman who inspired a king to defy the Pope, divorce his queen, and tear England away from Rome, was destroyed not just by the jealousy of a soured love, but by the hunger for power and control. She died alone, betrayed by the very man who once vowed to love her forever. But history has a memory of its own. 22 years later, Elizabeth, the daughter Henry had once dismissed as worthless for not being a son, was crowned Queen of England. She ruled for 44 years in what would come to be known as the glorious Elizabethan age, and that was Anne Boleyn's final, resounding victory, quiet but eternal. Anne Boleyn's death did not simply mark the end of a life, it ignited a new chapter in English history. She did not die because of guilt, but because she dared to step into the center of power with ambition, intellect, and a vision far ahead of her time. She did not fall from weakness, but because she threatened the very foundations of a male-dominated order. In a society where a woman's worth was measured by bloodline and fertility, Anne Boleyn shattered the mold. She became a voice, a choice, and ultimately a danger to the old world. And for that, she was ruthlessly erased. But what the powerful men of her time never anticipated was that Anne's true legacy would not lie in the crown she once wore, but in the resurrection that followed her death. The child once dismissed Elizabeth rose to the throne not only to prove her own worth, but to reclaim the destiny that was violently stolen from her mother. Anne Boleyn may have been erased from the records by her enemies, but history does not belong to the victors. It belongs to those who carve their mark deep into the human soul. And in the wind that sweeps across the Tower of London, where she once walked to her death, one might still hear a silent prayer, defiant, proud, and unbroken.